Well, hello and welcome everyone. It's absolutely wonderful to see you all. My name's Heidi Norman and I'm based here in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences and I'm Associate Dean Indigenous. We have quite a bit to get through this evening and we have four wonderful speakers, and I'll invite our first speaker up now, Auntie Norma Ingram, to acknowledge country, and I also acknowledge you as somebody who has a long affiliation with UTS. I have a long and strong connection with you, and I know you've been working tirelessly on this referendum.
Thank you. Oh, thanks everyone for coming out on such a night. After it's getting a little bit cold. Yamadu Marung, you and do Auntie Norma Ingram, Gali Wiradjuri, Yuna. Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see you all, and thank you, Heidi, for inviting me. So I've just said hello to you in my language. So I'm Wiradjuri, mid-west New South Wales, the Lachlan River, Cowra. So I was born in being the youngest of 11 children, I was one of the first ones to be born in Cowra Hospital. The rest of them were born on the Aboriginal Reserve Ramsey. We lived under what was known as the Aboriginal Welfare Act, totally controlled by the New South Wales government through what we call the mission manager through the Welfare Act. So we weren't allowed to speak our language, we weren't allowed to practice culture, we weren't own property, we weren't allowed to do anything. So yes, we did not have a voice. And so my mother, I'm the youngest of 11 children, and my mother came down to Sydney when I was still quite young, and we moved down to Gadigal in Redfern. So I've lived in Gadigal, Newtown, Erskineville then for most of my life. When I think about just acknowledging country or even welcome to country. So as an Aboriginal elder, our Aboriginal elders are respectfully through Aboriginal culture referred to as auntie or uncle. So I'm an Aboriginal elder in Redfern, and I think I'm respected as an Aboriginal elder in Redfern because I know a lot of people who walk up the street say, "Hello, Auntie Norma, how are you?" And these are not only Aboriginal people, which is wonderful, it's everybody who knows me. So we need to keep that culture flowing, and that's why I like to say at least hello to people in my language, because for me so much of, well, just about all of it was lost, but the old people said, look, we can't speak our language, we can't practice our culture, because if we do, the welfare will come and take our children away. So they were always mindful of that under the Welfare Act, and we've all heard of the stolen generation. So since about the 1800s, and it still continues today, thousands and thousands of our Aboriginal children and babies were taken from their parents, taken from their families, taken from their communities, taken from the culture, the language and everything, and put into these institutions. And I was just having the discussion, if any of you have a look at the video, The Last Daughter, please go have a look at it. It's been advertised. But I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And so the Eora Nation that we acknowledge is bounded by the three rivers, and the Hawkesbury, the Nepean and the Georges River. And within those boundaries there are 29 small clan groups or family groups. And we've been here for over 65,000 years. But what I think comes out too is that we are now only 3% of the Australian population. That means that there's 97% of every other nationalities that's come here to call this beautiful, beautiful country home. Because we've got such a small number, we need to walk together. Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal people, we need to walk together. We need you. Same token, you need us. There's stuff that you cannot do unless you walk with us as Aboriginal First Nations people of this country. The Gadigal people are saltwater, sunrise people, and their totem is the Gurrawal or the whale. When we look at Aboriginal culture, we could see that, in the art, the stories. What wonderful storytellers we are. The stories, the dance, we could see it. As soon as we see any of this, we we just know immediately that this is Aboriginal culture. This is this great, beautiful country, this great, beautiful history. And we talk about truth-telling. Well, this is what we've been doing. We've been telling the truth since 1788, since those tall ships come in. We continue to tell those stories. Heidi mentioned that I have affiliation with UTS. Well, I'm the first Aboriginal person to graduate from Harvard University in 1985, so thank you. So when I did that, I came straight here to UTS. And I think if I'm not the first Aboriginal person who received tenure here, there might have been another fella, Barry. I think he might have been the first, and I think I might have been the second person. So, you know, we'll continue to have that affiliation. We do need our people to be in all spaces and places, and my mother was very strong and very powerful in us getting an education. And she said, look, we cannot get along unless we do get an education. My mother was about 5'0" and my father was about 6'2". He was very tall. But I remember my mother always saying to me, she said, I will vote. I will vote in every election that I can, because I and my people were not allowed to vote. Now I have the opportunity, now I can have a say, now I can have a voice. And she passed away in 87. But that's still, and I guess I walk in the footsteps of a lot of warriors that I am a descendant of. I'm a descendant of Windradine, a warrior who fought against Captain Arthur Phillip and the army. You may have all heard of Pemulwuy. We had Windradine of the Bathurst. That's my mother's ancestor. My mother fought against the Aboriginal welfare people. She fought against the police for our rights and to make sure that we get a fair go. So we will continue that legacy. My parents were part of the 1938 fighting for Aboriginal citizens' rights. And, you know, the fight is just not now. Not just now, just fighting for yes. And I'll be voting yes. If you don't know that by now, I'll be voting yes. But there's been a long, long history. And I'm sure that, you know, Andrew or somebody will be talking about that history tonight, about what we have continued to do since 1788. One of my nieces said, when did this all start, Auntie? I said 1788, when those tall ships came in. That's when it started, and we will continue to fight for our rights, our recognition. Remember, Terra Nullius, this land, from the English, was founded from them, by them, on this lie of Terra Nullius. Terra, land, Nullius mean no people lived here. So there was no way they were going to fight and negotiate a treaty if they didn't think we were human beings, that we were under the Fauna and Flora Act. So when I welcome you to country, if I acknowledge country, that's acknowledging Mother Earth. She's powerful. When you get a chance, take your shoes and socks off. Just stand on Mother Earth. Talk to her, say, I'm here, I protect you, I will look after you, I mean you no harm. Because I know for me, my ancestors are continuously looking at me and making sure that I do the right thing. Because if I don't do the right thing, I will be punished, but maybe worse than that, members of my family may be punished. And so I just say this because we cannot even move forward, really, to talk about voting yes or no, but voting yes, unless we do know that history. The history that, you know, I'm still alive here, I'm still living. I've been through all of that. I did not have a voice. So now we've got the opportunity to have a voice. We've got to stop our babies and our children being taken away. They're still being taken away. We've got to stop our young men being taken away and being incarcerated. We've got to stop all of this that's happening, and we've got to stop listening to the false information that's going out there that it just seems to be, you know, opening the can of worms to let everybody who hates Aboriginal people just go out and say what they want to say and just get away with it. Well, it's not on. We're not going to allow it. We will continue to be out there fighting. I'm sorry, but I do have to say, if we don't get the yes vote up, and we will, I would just hate to see what this country is like. So I just want to acknowledge our elders, our Aboriginal elders, elders from other nations, other cultures, and the next generations too. So this stuff is like, I do get a little bit carried away, get a little bit emotional. I'm not going to stop that. I'm not going to apologise for that, because we need to continue talking. We need to continue to talk to our families, our friends. Unfortunately, South Sydney Rabbitohs is not going to win the comp this year. But yeah, please, whatever you can do, people ask me, what can you do? Go out and talk to your family, because I'm not there. I'm not with your family. I'm not with your friends, but you are. So you have a responsibility. So let's all walk together and get everybody as much as we need to vote yes. Yay.
Well, thank you, Auntie Norma. What a great note to start on. This annual lecture is in honour of our wonderful colleague, dear friend and collaborator, Andrew Jakubowicz. Andrew's work at UTS spanned 30 years. He finished as Professor of Sociology, along with being the director of a terrific research centre where many of us were members, Cosmopolitan Civil Societies, and head of our academic group, Social and Political Change, in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. The focus of today's lecture, I'm just going to see how this goes. The focus of today's lecture should come as no surprise that we are discussing multicultural solidarity with Indigenous peoples' rights and aspirations. Consideration of this connection has been a, there should be some photos there. Consideration of this connection has long been a feature of Andrew's intellectual life. One story I like to share is him heading off in 1969 with a busload of rugby league players, the Redfern All Blacks, on the long trip to Casino. If you have the power there, can you... Green button. In northern New South Wales. Armed with a new camera, he was a photographer on tour in 1969. At a time when this sort of media was limited, these are priceless shots of the teams and the carnival hosted in Casino. Self-described eastern suburbs Jewish boy, it is clear that careful consideration of the self are conditions on which Andrew's politics and research are always informed. He dedicated his doctoral thesis in 1974 to his mother, Estera Weiland. Hope I've got that right, Andrew. Pronounce that. He described her as a stranger in a strange land. She was a refugee survivor from the Holocaust in occupied Poland and spent 5 years in Shanghai, where she led support for refugees. Since the early 1970s, he has been involved in action research and race relations and has been centrally involved in the development of materialist theories of cultural diversity. He has published widely in the fields of cultural diversity, social policy, refugees, Jewish cultural studies, media sociology, disability studies, Indigenous study and new media. In 1994, he led the research team that produced Racism, Ethnicity and the Media with Heather Goodall. From Those Who Have Come Across the Seas with Christina Ho, and with myself and Archie Thomas, we produced the book, Does the Media Fail? Aboriginal Political Aspirations. It was a study of 45 years of media coverage, and that was published in 2020. He was involved in multimedia documentaries such as Making Multicultural Australia, the website Making Multicultural Australia in the 21st Century, developed jointly with the Office of the Board of Studies, won the 2005 Best Secondary Educational Website category of the Annual Excellence in Educational Publishing Awards. He also worked on the Once Upon a Time series, a duo of multi-part documentaries on SBS that explored crime, conflict and community in suburbs, the names of which had become symbolic of ethnic criminality in Sydney's inner west. With colleagues from 5 other universities, he initiated the Cyber Racism and Community Resilience Project in 2012, which reported in 2017. In all this work, Andrew has focused on, and I quote, how intimately implicated the media were in the structures and processes of Australian society's patterns of racism. He has indeed made a significant contribution to our work here at UTS, and particularly in multicultural studies and broader themes of solidarity. So thank you, Andrew, and it is indeed an honour to once again host your annual lecture. Now, I'm going to hand over now to our first speaker, Michelle Deshong, who we are absolutely thrilled to have you visiting us, Michelle. And Michelle is speaking in part in her capacity as one of the Yes 23 ambassadors. And Michelle is Director of Deshong Consulting. She's worked in fields of gender equity, leadership, governance and political science. She's co-chair of Supply Nation and member of the AATSIS Council. She draws connection to Kuku Yalanji Nation in North Queensland. So welcome, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. And of course, I want to firstly say thank you all to everybody who has filled the seats here this evening to take the opportunity to listen and to learn and to gain some insight into what is an extremely critical and current conversation. I don't really have a speech because I figured that today was probably going to shape where I would end up by this evening, and certainly I've already made about 12 different notes on my 3 dot points that I had before I took this microphone. Before continuing too much further, I want to acknowledge that I am a Kuku-Yalanji woman. I come from the saltwater and rainforest people of North Queensland, so I get the best of both worlds. Places like Sydney are nice to visit, but it's a little bit too cool for me at the moment. I felt that even just walking over here this evening. But it's been an absolute honour for me to be surrounded in my early years by trailblazers, by elders, by people who were knowledge holders and were already fighting the good fight. And what I didn't realise is, as a person growing up in regional North Queensland in the 70s and 80s, the things that I was observing, experiencing and hearing at that time were probably going to shape my life in a way that not many people in my family could imagine. But I am extremely thankful for those who were in those spaces, the aunties and uncles, the agitators, the activists, the people who just would not sit down and would not be silenced. And whenever I think about my political journey, I'm always reflecting to people that that's exactly the point at which my political seed was sown. And it was inevitable that I would end up in places like universities, but also parliaments and in places of influence and change, particularly for Indigenous people. I want to also acknowledge, of course, that this lecture is in honour of Andrew and the work that you've done. Phenomenal pieces of work up there, and I'm sure that I might need to probably have a bit of a chat with you later, because I'd love to talk about, does the media fail us? I think the answer is yes, in so many ways. And again, even growing up in North Queensland at that particular time, I didn't realise the things that I was consuming, being fed to me by others. And to make the connection into Sydney, when I was in the public service and I got a job down here, and they said, you're going to work, I was at the Department of Social Security at the time, and they said, you're going to work in Redfern. And I went, Redfern? I'm not going to Redfern. There's some crazy black people in Redfern, right? And of course, all of that was predicated on what the media had told me about the dysfunction, about the violence, about the social problems that existed in Redfern. So anyway, to cut a long story short, after about 3 months in the job, and I was based at Marrickville and had to outreach to Redfern and other places, my boss pulls me aside and she says, can I just remind you that you're actually supposed to service other places other than Redfern? Because once I'd gotten there, I'd connected up with people from all across the country, even North Queenslanders, and it was a place of comfort and a place of safety as an Indigenous person, because our lived experiences were ones that we were sharing. And so it's always really important to come back and to acknowledge Gadigal lands, to think about those moments that shape the pivotal conversations, the new knowledge and the opportunities that I have had as an Aboriginal woman. So I stand here, I'm going to be 52 years of age Saturday, and I think about 52 trips around the sun, and they've been incredible ones, but I also think about what does the future trips around the sun look like for me, but more importantly for my children and the grandchildren that I keep telling my children I need to have at some point if they want me to help with them. But, you know, that importantly, this isn't about just us right here and now, but about the things that will happen in the future and how we can shape history, right? Because we all can look back and realise that there were significant moments, significant conversations and important people who led change. And so when I was thinking about the question that was posed to us, I like the idea that what we're pushing out there is not just a conversation about whether you should vote yes or no and all the reasons why the Constitution is what it is, and, you know, the pros and cons of wherever you sit in society. But for me, what I wanted to do is kind of take you forward 10 years. And this was how I kind of approached what I think I want to see at that point. So if I'm nearly 62, which is a bit scary, but in 10 years' time, do I look back at the year of 2023 and think about it as a historical, pivotal moment? If I say yes to that, then what that looks like for me as I sit on the porch with all those grandkids that don't exist yet, that it's an important conversation that I get to watch them be able to harness an education that is founded on the idea and the recognition of Indigenous peoples as First Nations peoples of this country. That they have been able to access an education system where their language is taught and preserved, that they are not required to do projects about the First Fleet, but are inclusive in the history of the nation and what their contribution is to what is the nation state, essentially, as young Aboriginal people. I think about the capability of our mob to have rallied together and created opportunities out of recognition of rights, native title, self-determination that has led to self-governance, and our ability to make decisions on our own terms. This is the thing that we strive for as Indigenous people and have for generations. But importantly, for me, when we talk about sovereignty, and I know that that word comes up a lot at the moment, there's this terminology that I go, sovereignty by stealth. Sovereignty by stealth means that nobody gets to take our sovereignty away from us. We as individuals are sovereign people. And so if we want to act in a way that is sovereign, it means we control our own destinies. We make our own decisions, we prioritise the things that are important to us, and we as a collective, either that as a nation or as our collective population as Indigenous people, we support each other to achieve those things that we set as our own priorities through our own mechanisms, through our own intentions and through our own people. And we give strength to that. And so for me, that's a really powerful place to be, because I think as I look across the globe, there are many examples of where that already exists. And in some ways in Australia, we're just playing catch up. But that doesn't mean that we haven't been strong in all of those things thus far. It means that there's been a number of barriers that have hindered us. So for me in 2032, those barriers have been taken away. They've been dismantled, and we have accepted that Indigenous people are a valuable part of this nation, that we contribute to an economy, we create our own businesses. I couldn't be on the board of Supply Nation and not mention the contribution that is being made to, you know, the economics of this country by Indigenous people running their own businesses and employing their own people, becoming entrepreneurs and even exporters across the globe. And these things will only increase in capability when we control the world that we live in, that we are not limited by the jurisdictions of our states, and that we have the opportunity to have the viability to make these decisions and to affirm our own destinies. So in thinking about that, I probably want to just flick back to the late 1980s. And in the late 1980s, I had the fortunate opportunity to go over to New Zealand as an exchange student. I was obviously one of the first people in my family to, you know, finish high school. And this opportunity was afforded to me. Now, one of the most important reflections that I can make of that time is the astounding way in which Māori culture is part of the social fabric of New Zealand. You cannot arrive in New Zealand without seeing Māori culture everywhere. You can pretty much not walk down the street without seeing Māori language, place names, you know, that you can hear people talking. Now you can turn on the TV and see Māori people on every channel in the nation, but also, for me, the most profound part was when we started the school year, so I got to do 6 months at a high school there, and basically nobody even entered a classroom until they had entered a marae, and that there was a welcome ceremony, that there was a affirmation of place, there was a recognition of country, and there was a recognition of purpose. And so for me, when I look to that 2032, I want those things to be the norm. I want people to see us in every space and place. I want Indigenous people to be a part of the social fabric of this nation. And I also want us to be an important part of the democracy of this country, because, as I mentioned, I think we ultimately are playing a little bit of catch up, and we shouldn't have had to do that. But we know that it's an important path that we are on, and you know, that when you get to 2032 and we've been able to look back and go, these are the gains that we have made in the past 10 years, it helps us to realise what might be the gains in the next 10 and in the next 20. And it really does require us to be brave, to have difficult conversations, to recognise that we can have different points of view, but in the end what we want to do is create a nation where everybody feels included and safe and valued. And so for me, in thinking about the question that you posed, that was kind of where I went to. I thought about what do I want my children to be talking about in 2032, and I definitely don't want them to be having the same conversation then that I know we were certainly having in the 80s and 90s. I think the other thing, just obviously what has been an important message that has somehow been lost in the last few months, is that Indigenous people are a generous people. Given the circumstance by which we've had to live and exist over these generations, that we could be extremely bitter people. We could hate on the world, and yet instead of doing that, what we have done as Indigenous people has offered this nation an opportunity to see us, to respect us, and to hear us. And I don't think there's any greater gift to give than to recognise the generosity of First Nations people despite all of that history, to say this is an important place for all of us, and that it is important for us to all reflect on those moments and be, I guess, to take on a really informed view in a number of weeks' time when you get the opportunity to decide if the future that you want looks a little bit like my 2032, or whether 2032 looks just like it does today. And to me, that's not progress, because our nation has certainly changed in the past 100 years, and change is not always something that's a terrible thing to see. We know that change can also bring with it great opportunity, great prosperity, great nations, great people, but also a society that we all want to be proud of, all inclusive of, and a place where we can celebrate our successes with each other every day, all day, and about twice on Sundays. So, thank you. That's I'm going to wrap that up because I think we're going to have some questions. Yeah. But yeah, for me, that's kind of where I feel like we're on the precipice of. It's an important time in our political, social, economic histories, and each of you have a job to do, as do the people who will speak here tonight. But, you know, importantly, this is about a collective opportunity that most of us have never been gifted in our lifetimes to do. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I am with you on the 2032. Yeah, what we hope to be living through then. Now, earlier I should have mentioned that we are operating Slido, so if you have any questions you'd like to put through, please feel free to post them now, and I will be checking them on my phone. Next up, we have Craig Foster. Craig is a member of the Australian Multicultural Council and co-chair of the Australian Republic Movement. He's a former footballer and broadcaster and adjunct professor in sport and social responsibility at Torrens University. Thanks very much for joining us, and I think we've got about 8 minutes.
Okay, all right. Okay, thank you. I just want to acknowledge also the traditional owners of land, and thank you to Auntie for the welcome, and thank you all for the invitation to be here. I was not just thrilled to hear Michelle speak, but I was equally inspired by your vision of what Australia looks like in a few years' time, and it is certainly true that the opportunity ahead of us can fundamentally change the nature of what Australia is and how we see ourselves, and that gift is being offered by First Nations people. The question is, I think, why Australia is in some way engaging in so much argumentation about what is a simple proposition, and why we're kind of recoiling from that proposition and from that opportunity. So I just want to acknowledge also Andrew's fabulous work, and I might just start briefly, just for a few minutes, talk a little bit about multiculturalism, and then perhaps we go back in time to 1788, which we heard Auntie talk about, and then go forward as to what it might look like. And also just a couple of points around the current referendum and some of the issues that we're seeing. I know we're going to do some Q&A, but just a couple of the more egregious issues that we're seeing play out in the public domain, because they all are very much linked. So Michelle talked about a vision of Australia where everyone is equal and where the real history of the country is acknowledged and actually owned by all of us. As a co-chair of the Australian Republic, of course, I see the future of the country as the sovereignty being vested on this continent and in this soil for all of us, for First Nations and non-Indigenous Australians. And therefore, the Uluru Statement, the voice, treaty and truth is all incredibly important part of that. But one day in the not too distant future, I hope that we fully own and have this country vested in all of us in a way that truly acknowledges the real history of the country. And in that vision, everyone has to be equal. Multiculturalism has to mean that no one in this country of any different cultural background, irrespective of what it is, or faith background, or heritage or tradition, faces any barrier that others do not face. And therefore, one of the reasons why I'm the co-chair of the Republic is because it's still one, firstly, Australia, we do not fully own our own country, but secondly, there is one position which is barred to all of us. And if we say that we are a truly multicultural country, distinct from being a very diverse country, which of course is demonstrably true, but a multicultural country, if we say that we really are that, then the true nature of that is that no position within Australian society, whether that is social, cultural, civil society, or political or institutional, can be beyond any of us, irrespective of our background. Now, I saw today a wonderful video from what they call themselves South Asian Australians. Some of you might have seen, I think it was just started to be shared today. South Asian Australians for Yes, for the Voice. And what occurred to me was that it's beautiful to see as part of this broader movement, and I think it's all really the same in many ways, to see many of our different cultural communities actually being at the forefront of a really important national conversation, not just an adjunct. And that wouldn't have happened. It certainly didn't happen in '99 when we talked about the last Republic referendum. That wasn't the case. Nor were we having the same conversations in '99 about First Nations, because at that point we didn't even have this much of the truth. We just wanted to move forward in what was the current construct of that time in the late 90s. Whereas today we recognise that in order to move forward, it has to be on a basis of truth, justice, and understanding the actual real national story here. So, just as we see now the most diverse federal parliament in Australia's history, even though it's still falling so far short of the beautifully diverse demography that we have, nevertheless, that movement is moving forward. We're also, thankfully now, seeing our real face of Australia engaging in this important issue, because this is about what it means to be Australian. This is about what it means to be Australia. And therefore, finally, we're actually seeing all of our cultural communities come to that. However, there's still a barrier, and we talk about courageous conversations. I was in another environment a couple of days ago, actually it was Aboriginal Affairs, New South Wales. We're talking about food equity, and they were using the same term. And it was a really powerful room with actually with the acumen and the real opportunity and ministers there to actually do something real about it. And I said to them, we use courageous conversations a lot, but do we really have them? And when it gets difficult, we tend to, as a country, just recoil back a little bit. And I think part of the reason for that, if not the whole reason actually, is that we don't want to go backwards. And the Uluru Statement, and now the voice to Parliament, has brought out this real fight. I heard Auntie before say that, you know, we've been fighting for a long time. That's undoubtedly true. But I do get the sense that this actually, we finally got to the real fight. You know, now we're actually talking about what Australia means and how it was founded. And that's what the Uluru Statement is about. The Uluru Statement is about getting Australia to acknowledge, actually, like we say now on Australia Day, that this wasn't about settlement, it was about dispossession. It was about terra nullius. And it actually was about the stealing of land. Now, again, those terms are very easy to say, but if we truly accept them and internalise and normalise them, that changes a lot. And so the powerful forces in Australia now, I think it's very normal that they're fighting extremely hard to maintain that creation story of Australia, because that's the central nervous system of this country. Recently, I sat on the day of the coronation on ABC with Stan Grant, and that was a really interesting moment, because on the day of the coronation seems to me to be the ideal, in fact the optimal, and more than that, the most important moment to have an actual real conversation about dispossession, terra nullius, and how Australia started. And to me that should be non-controversial. We talk about it all the time, right? But we had that conversation on air, and you heard from Stan Grant, someone whose family has had first-hand lived experience of stolen generations and of all of the, impacts that we're hearing about, thankfully, at this moment, and against which we're seeing such, I think, a predictable but a very strong reaction. And what was interesting in the moment was the response of a small section, but still a loud and reasonably powerful section of Australian society and media. And what that reaction was this, that essentially you may be, or we know that you're right, but we just don't want to talk about it. We just don't want it acknowledged. And we don't want it acknowledged on the day of the coronation. As though the point of ascension of the monarch is not the time to talk about the monarch and the true history of the monarch. And the response in that moment showed me a lot about Australia now, a country which I deeply love, by the way, but which true love of one's own country means challenging it in every way, challenging it to be better and to be real. And what happened was, I got the predictable abuse, that we get when we talk about refugees and human rights and First Nations and other things. That's completely normal. But Stan got that abuse, I would say probably 100-fold to me. But then what he in addition got was deeply vicious, vile, racialised abuse and vilification. I didn't get that. In fact, I've never got that. And the reason I've never got that is because I don't have to acknowledge the birth of post-colonial, multicultural Australia and the truths there. I don't have to, and many Australians don't. And the trouble we're having at the moment with The Voice is that it's asking us to acknowledge that. And what we see is, of course, a lot of misinformation and so on, but ultimately, in my view, what it's really all about is not wanting to tell the truth about our Australian history. I've been saying in recent months that First Nations Australians are carrying immense load at the moment. Okay, you've got to educate Australians about their own constitution, which is already a big challenge because our civic education in relation to our constitution and other elements, and even our own true history, has been sadly lacking. That's a big task already. Secondly, dealing with the inevitable racism that was always going to come because of the question that you're asking Australia. You're not asking them just about an actual voice to Parliament. What you're doing really is we're asking Australians, all of us, to accept a different version of our history post-1788. That's what this is asking us to do. And I'm inspired by the number of Australians who are prepared to do that. The next generation are fully prepared to do. The next generation, in fact, they already live that. And so under 40 Australians, for them, the research is really clear. They said, what are you guys talking about? Like, what are we waiting for? Right? That's not the issue. The issue is those of us who have grown up in this country being told a different version. And now is our opportunity to come to that and to make an admission, an inspiring admission, to say, we actually now get it. we understand what happened to you, and we are reaching back 235 years to join hands then. It's not just joining hands now. The reason that's important is because what we saw during COVID, and we hear from many of our cultural groups here in Australia, is that they still face an immense amount of racism. And we had Asian Australians, in particular, of course, during that COVID period, which was predictable, but many other communities who continue to tell us that they have lack of access to representation, to decision-making and to power, including in politics, that we still have very serious issues about representation at C-suite and management levels and board levels and so on in the country. So we do not still see the diversity, the beautiful diversity of Australian life coming to life across all of our institutions. Now that should be totally normal. And what I think we're increasingly coming to realise is that the way we look at our own diversity and access and representation and genuine equality for everyone is very much predicated on the lie that goes back to 1788. In 1992, that's 30 years ago, when the High Court already, I think somewhat courageously, but that's their job, nevertheless, it's not a given, ruled on Mabo. And 30 years ago, they said that terra nullius was a lie. Today, we're being asked for all of us to actually acknowledge that as true. And now simply to recognise First Nations people and to actually really listen. Multicultural communities in a post-colonial multicultural nation are also screaming. I always say that's the next conversation. Multicultural communities are saying we also need to be listened to. That's why I love seeing that video today. Finally, we're actually starting to see our real face coming to life. They also need to be listened to. But broader Australia, and much of the media is a party to this, want to maintain, the current idea that for them is so safe. Progress and an inspiring vision of a future Australia is not about staying within that zone. It's about acknowledging what happened, joining hands with First Nations, and finally vesting the sovereignty of all of us, wherever we're from and however long we've been here, in us, in this earth, and finally being able to say that First Nations people are worthy and that we all can share in the 65,000 years. We can't. We can't yet. We can talk about it, but we can't share in it. Well, how can we share without equity? How can we share without equality? How can we share without acknowledgement? How can we share without self-determination, without basic rights? I just finished with a couple of issues in relation to the current campaign. This concept that if you don't know, vote no, is one of the most disgraceful statements that we saw in the Republic referendum in '99, like 25 years ago. You would have thought we'd be past it. Unfortunately, it still seems to be effective. The fact that anyone in Australian public or political life is genuinely saying to Australians, stay ignorant in order to support our argument, is just staggering in 2023. It's just unbelievable. Surely, in any a political or civil society issue, or what they might call debate, the first principle is become as educated as possible, and the more educated you become, the more we believe that you'll side with us, because we are right and we are just. Surely both sides of the campaign have to be saying that. Here's the truthful information. As soon as you digest it, we know you're with us, because we're on the right side of history. We're right. To say, stay ignorant, don't read, don't understand your own constitution, don't understand self-determination, don't understand human rights, that is shocking. And that alone should be enough of a trigger for every Australian to say, that is not the democracy that we want. We want a democracy where we own our own country, where we're joined with First Nations and their sovereignty, where we have makarata and agreement making between us, and where every single Australian has access to every single position here on a completely equal basis. No one is left out, no one is less than any other, and Australia is represented by Australians, based on a foundation of truth and historical justice. That takes education, that takes work, and that takes a country brave enough, as you heard Michelle, to take what is a very simple step forward into a brighter future. The pushback against it is completely natural. And just finally, I hear people saying that it's dividing us. Actually, it's doing precisely the opposite. It's actually bringing us together. But it feels like we're being divided. That's because we're having to push through that big issue at the heart of Australian society that we have never, ever wanted to contend with. 235 years of denial are coming out now, and we've only got 40 days to get through that. When we get through it, if we're courageous enough to get through it, now we have the courage to have other conversations. We have the courage to hear from all of our multicultural communities. We have the courage to talk about real equality. We have the courage to talk about real Australian values and what we look like in future. We'll get there, but this is a remarkable, historic, very rare opportunity for all of us to take on the real fight, to get to the real heart of who we are and who we want to be. I hope that we do have the courage in just 40 days' time to take that important step. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Craig. I'm not doing a very good job as chair. I'm enjoying the speeches too much. Now, next up we have Jason Yat-sen Li. He's member for Strathfield, the New South Wales Parliament. He's also worked in law, business, community advocacy, particularly for diversity and inclusion, and he's pro-chancellor of that university up the road there.
Thanks so much, Heidi. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. Can I also acknowledge the Gadigal people? May we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Can I acknowledge my good friend Andrew, who I've known for, 30-something years now, in the early Unity days when we were fighting the good fight against Pauline Hanson and One Nation. They're still doing all right. They're really falling apart a little bit now. Can I acknowledge Auntie Norma? She and I were heavily involved in the Republic debate back in 1999. Good to see you, Norma, with another referendum, but we're going to finish this one differently. My dad, in his old age, started getting obsessed with DNA. I don't know if your dad's sort of does. He made us all get DNA tests. And we all came back as 100% Han Chinese. And, I thought about that. And I thought about what that means. And, you can trace your generations back, a few generations, but then you lose it. You can only, because of the Cultural Revolution and everything else, we could probably go back 3 or 4 generations and then it's lost. But I thought, because of the 100% DNA, it probably goes back time sort of immemorial. We don't know when it stops, but we can only assume that from some time our family were always rooted, deeply connected with the land in China. Until in 1960, Dad got on a boat and he made the journey over here. And he started a new life with Mum, built everything from the ground up. And with that, I think, pretty common migration story, that link for us with our ancestral sort of land in China was severed, it was broken. And we've built a new home. Now, we love Australia. Mum and Dad love Australia. And look, we won't be going back to China. We'll be buried here. Or our ashes will be buried here. The future of our family is here now. But Mum and Dad, and me as well, I can't say that we have engaged really deeply or knowledgeably with the vast Indigenous history of our country, or with reconciliation. Mum and Dad have I think, a better excuse than I do. They were just working hard. They just worked hard to build, a new life. They just didn't have the headspace to engage spiritually or politically with Australia. And therefore, when I think about it, I kind of think that my Australianness, our Australianness, the Australianness of my family, is still unfinished, right? It's still incomplete. I'm struggling, I've got to say, with the Yes campaign in my local area amongst the multicultural communities. I'm struggling. And I think that part of the reason for that is because there hasn't been that deep connection or understanding, that opportunity to engage deeply with 65,000 year, in Indigenous history. And that means that a lot of people from migrant communities are just so vulnerable to the scare campaigns. Craig's talked about some of the scare campaigns. You should see some of the stuff that's floating around the Chinese community. It's, stuff like you're going to have to transfer your house. They're very smart about it. They know exactly the hot buttons to push. I saw something the other day that 30% of selective school places will go to Indigenous children. If Yes gets up, they know exactly the hot buttons, to push to outrage particular communities. And so I think a challenge for the Yes campaign, for all of us that support a Yes vote in this referendum, is we got to reach into the communities, and we've got to build engagement and build a compelling narrative for Yes. And I think that there are three components of that. The first is the rudimentary stuff about the voice itself, what it is, what it means. I won't go into that. You guys know that. It is simple, it is modest, it is about recognition, it is about giving people a say in the policies that impact them, thereby leading to better outcomes. It's just common sense. Right? The second bit, I think, that we can mobilise is about justice, right? I think it's an argument about justice that will resonate with a lot of migrant communities. When I was little, Grandma used to tell us a whole lot of stories about what happened to China in the pre-war years, in the Japanese invasion, the Opium Wars, all the Chinese that were slaughtered, by the imperial sort of Japanese, how China was carved up by foreign forces. Told us these stories, really harrowing stories. I think migrants from the Middle East, they have millennia. Those of you who've read Richard Feidler's book, The Book of Kingdoms and Roads, millennia of displacement, disruption, dislocation, the battles there. People from Africa, from Southeast Asia, from South America, from India, they know the harrowing history of colonisation. Migrants understand the visceral pain of losing one's ancestral homelands. And, yep, I think my family and most migrants, they won't have experienced being torn away from their families. And they certainly don't experience the same degree of disadvantage that Indigenous Australians experience. But I think migrants share a lived experience of racism with Indigenous Australians. And we share a common struggle for belonging and respect. And so the argument that I make to migrant communities, if First Nations people in all of these circumstances cannot achieve justice, then what hope is there? What hope is there for migrant Australians to achieve that justice? The third argument, the third pillar, I think, of the argument, which I actually think is the most profound, is this. I think the referendum, the vote that we have at the moment, is an invitation for all Australians, so multicultural Australia, Craig was talking about this, to embrace and to join together with Indigenous Australia and to thereby fuse our past, our present and our future into one powerful, unifying tenet. And I think this is the soaring ambition that is at the centre of the Uluru Statement from the heart, for us to be able to imagine ourselves as a better nation and to walk together in that, in that way. It's an invitation to, it's a sort of communion, it's an invitation to a sort of spiritual communion with Australia. And as Craig said, I think so eloquently, if you love something, you take the good and the bad. It's about sharing in our country's joy as well as our pain, our shame as well as our pride, our darkest demons as well as our brightest angels. And it's an invitation to love and embrace our beautiful but imperfect nation as a whole. And if we can do that, then maybe we ourselves will be made whole. Our Australianness will be complete. Craig talked about Stan Grant. I knew Stan in China, and we were at a mutual friend's dinner. And I was texting him afterwards, and he wrote back and he said, we said a number of things, and then he called me, my brother. And this wasn't the sort of, hey bro kind of thing, right? I think there was something, I felt something. This was an Indigenous man calling a second generation Chinese immigrant my brother. And I felt a bit of the power of that at the time, and I think that is what is at the centre. That is what is at the centre of the Uluru Statement of the heart. And I think this sentiment, this is a sentiment for all of us, because aside from First Nations people, I think we're all migrants to Australia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. I think, I can't remember being at an event where we've just heard from such fantastic speakers. So thank you very much. I feel quite inspired. And not forgetting that the next 40 days are going to be extremely difficult. We've got an enormous challenge ahead of us. But I think your words this evening have certainly given me a lot of food for thought. Now, I've made an executive decision to, unless I hear protest, to skip Q&A and cut to Andrew. Hope that's okay. And because my chairing was inadequate and I let these terrific speakers go on, but I really enjoyed hearing from you. Thank you very much. So I'll now ask Andrew, who has lent his name and reputation to this event this evening, and who we care about dearly. And you've been a tremendous colleague of ours, and I'll be keen to hear your reflection on the speakers this evening.
It's not often that I'm lost for words, but I do have to say that as Michelle and Craig and Jason were speaking, I just thought there really are two strange Australias. There's one that is lyrical, forward-looking, dreams of a better future and thinks it knows how to get there. And there's one that is abusive, destructive, self-hating, and essentially cowardly. So I just want to make a few comments, because maybe we'll have time when I finish to... I don't want to hog the floor. But as people were talking, I was thinking back to my first year at university. I think that probably puts me... Yeah, it was an interesting year. When I first went to university, there were no Indigenous people in the Australian census. No record. There were no Indigenous voters in the Australian elections. And then in 2 years, there was also a period of fierce white Australia where assimilation was the way in which we dreamt the country would go. And yet in a period of 2 short years, there were sort of 2 major changes. One, of course, was the referendum, which recognised that Indigenous people existed and that they had a future in this country. Because for a long time, Australians imagined there was no future for the Indigenous population. It would simply disappear, disintegrate, dissolve, turn to dust, and we'd all drop a few tears and then it would all be over. And that began to change with the referendum, I think, and with a new generation which felt that that wasn't the future we wanted. The second thing that changed, and I've really only come to grips with this in detail over the last few weeks working on a project, a guy called Bob Menzies, who'd been Prime Minister for God knows how long, retired at the beginning of 1966 and was replaced by the long-distance swimmer Harold Holt. Right. Now, Holt was actually quite an interesting character, and had he survived, he would have, I think, been a very interesting Liberal Prime Minister. But he did 2 things. As soon as Menzies was out of the way, he'd been the Immigration Minister. He instructed his people instructed the Immigration Department that they were going to change the policy. It was no longer going to be a policy of assimilation. It was now going to be a policy of integration. That happened within months of Menzies' disappearance. Secondly, the Department, the Minister, announced that up to 4,000 people from Asia were going to be allowed to migrate into Australia in the coming year, and that this would be the beginning of a change in the way in which we thought about ourselves. And these 2 things were not unrelated. Like, one of the reasons I think we have postcolonial or multicultural coming together is because they are brothers, sisters, siblings, whatever you want to call them. They are 2 sides of the same coin, and that both have to go together. So that struck me. So by the time I finished my undergraduate degree, Indigenous people were voting. Australia was stuck in a particularly bizarre war in Asia, which was fairly horrific, but it soon finished. And Australians decided they didn't want to go into that sort of thing again, and then they forgot and did it again and again and again. But that's another story. Okay, so where are we now? I mean, I've listened to the various takes from people on this, and as Heidi knows, I have a particular view on this, this whole thing. And this view is actually something I learnt from Heidi. When we were working on the media project, she talked to me a lot about the way we need to think about an Indigenous polity in Australia. That is, a political presence of the Indigenous people as part of the national political story, not as supplicants, but as partners in the whole thing. And as I've looked at the arguments from the no side, and indeed arguments from the yes side, it's become clear to me that many of the things that we were exploring then, and things that my colleagues and I have explored in previous research, are coming to crescendos of expression in this particular moment that we're in. And I think we arrived at the notion at the time when we were working on the media stuff that there were 4 major arguments that were used over and over and over again against the emergence of an Aboriginal Indigenous polity in Australia. That what, if you like, the colonial interest in Australia was about was ensuring that there would never be a unified Indigenous polity in this country, no matter what it took. And the one thing the Voice does is create a unified Indigenous polity. It also explains, for instance, why there are a significant number of Indigenous people who aren't positive about the Voice, because for them, a national polity may indeed wash away some of the possibilities of local political action. And I think that's something that needs to be recognised as a real issue in whatever comes out of this. But the 3 arguments that are put are the same arguments we're hearing now. 1, yes, you're invaded, we won, suck on it. That was the first one, right? The second one was something like, oh, yeah, you've got a point, but you don't want to really disturb everybody and make them all anxious, because that'll just go badly for you. Third argument, yeah, you're absolutely right, but now is not the time. Right. Now, these arguments are arguments of obfuscation, of postponement, of procrastination, and they have at their heart the goal of closing down, destroying, demobilising, whatever you want to call it, the possibility of an Aboriginal polity in this country. And from my perspective, if there is no national polity, then it can't speak to the nation. That's why, for me, the Voice is so important. It may not be a particularly easy line to run on Sky News. In fact, nothing's an easy line to run on Sky News. But my sense of it is that we are at, and this is the point I think that Craig referred to, we are at a point now of not only voice, but treaty and truth. And from my perspective, treaty is about whether or not Australia wants to stop the war. Right? When those guys in tall ships arrived here, they began a war. That war has never ended. It continues, day in, day out. Coming out of a Jewish background, I often see parallels to the sort of Nazis in Europe, and particularly the long war against the Jewish people in that context. A war of erosion, destruction, removal, all sorts of different strategies. But the aim was to maintain power over land, over place, over people. So I've been incredibly moved by 3 speakers tonight. I think the 3 perspectives have been fantastically interesting and perceptive. And while I have, if you like, reservations about the nature of the Australian government which is still, as they say, a sort of colonial government teetering on the edge of post-coloniality, I think that we all have a very strong role to play. And my dig for this week is I'm on Coogee Beach for 2 hours on Saturday morning handing out cards. And having done it before, I can tell you, the people who are smiling and are nice pass by very quickly. The people who grump and scream pass by very quickly. The people who confront you and try and tear you down stay around for a long time. And it's not an easy thing to do. I've always thought it's much easier to be racist than to be anti-racist. It's one of the lessons I think I've learnt from my long career in doing research in this area. So all power to you all, and thank you for coming, and particularly thank you to the speakers who have just been fantastic.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you, speakers. All that is left now is to give you a present, Jason, before you go. If you don't want this spot, bottle, you can leave it if it's too bulky to carry.
I've just got to get on a plane. Maybe
Yes. Well, maybe I'll give you...
donate it to the. Thank you.
Should we take a photo before you go?
I think so. Yeah, what a great idea. Yeah, what a great idea.
Quick photo op.
Yeah.
Okay. And while we get ready for photos, I'll just extend an invite to join us across the road at the Clare if anyone's up for that. Where's the photographer?
Yeah, quick. We should have a camera out here taking a picture of you all. Yeah. Bella? Bella?
Jason, come forward. Yeah, it's got the slide.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, all good? Thank you.
So I just say a few, sorry, I just wanted to take a few moments because I kind of tried to stick to time on the basis that we were having Q&A, and then we didn't. But anyway, there's just one of the key messages, and thank you for your summary, but I feel it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge, and I know that Craig spoke a little bit about this, but the load that Indigenous people are carrying at the moment is significant. There is no space that is safe, and you know, the things that we do in our everyday lives are now consumed by everybody wanting to hear your opinion, to rant their rant, to, you know, be abusive or supportive, but it is a really important thing, and I guess if nothing else changes for you after tonight, you may already have a very clear view. The one thing I would ask of you is to lean in, to offer levels of support, to take a little bit of the load off Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because the next 45 days are really difficult ones. And I think we sort of alluded to the fact before, but if the result is not in the positive, we will see a nation that overtly takes racist position in a way that I don't think we will have ever have seen before. And I just think it's one of those things that we have to be really mindful of, is that if we go to the nation and we said, here's a gift to you, and you go, sorry, not interested, that says a lot about our nation, but it also means that there are consequences for those who are involved in this movement. So that's probably just one of the things I wanted to say around, you know, just think about who's in your circles, how people are behaving, and what levels of support you can provide to all of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people around you in your workplaces, in your communities, even online, because often, you know, we feel quite isolated in that space. So that's just one of the things.
To Craig, that there may be a lot of healing that may be, I think, will be required. Whether it's yes or no after this,
Yeah, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, did I give you a book? No, you didn't. Another gift.
Thank you.
And I should also say thank you to Nuria Roberts for all your work in putting this together, Josh Box and Elizabeth Humphreys, and of course to you, Andrew. And what about you? Oh, and to me. I scored the bottle of wine.